Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
We are on chapter 1 of Shemot. If I am correct, which I am about half the time, we read the Pasuk, verse 11, but not the Rashi yet, right? We started breaking down the verse, but not the Rashi. So unless someone shouts at me that I'm wrong, that's what I'm going to go with. So to remind you, the verse itself, chapter 1, verse 11, right after the Pharaoh, or the king of Egypt, expresses concern lest the people grow, wage war against us, and depending on how you read the pshat, either they will force us to leave the land, right? They'll dispossess us, or they will leave our land and our economy will suffer, something like that. The response to that is verse 11. We read this last week. Vayasimu alav sarei misim. They placed upon it, and that singular it's going to continue to be significant in the Rashi. They, the Egyptians, we presume, placed upon it the nation of Israel, a singular nation. Sarei misim, officers or leaders of misim, perhaps. And we discussed last week how in modern Hebrew, mas has to do with the word tax, but Leonard was also telling us that an earlier form of the word was less related to tax than we think of. Why? Laman, in order to anoto, to oppress it, halachma anya, to afflict it, besivlotam, with their sufferings. And we discussed, and Rashi will play with it a bit, how to handle the it and the there. Who's suffering? Normally we would think their suffering would be the Israelite suffering. In order to oppress it with their own suffering, hard to know. But the person changes, it and their. Vayivein, and then singular, it built. Arei miskanot, cities of miskanot, and we left it mostly untranslated. It probably doesn't mean like the modern Hebrew miskain, like poor one. But we'll go into that in the Rashi. Lefaro, for Pharaoh. Et Pitom v'et Ramses. And now what we seem to have are the names of these cities they built, Pitom and Ramses. That's where we were. We had named some of the problems in the verse, or interesting points of the verse, Alav versus Alehem, Sivlotam versus Sivlo, and also what the word Miskanot means. Does anyone want to raise any other questions before we go into the Rashi that I didn't just encapsulate? Yes, Elon.
Not a question, just a comment. It's refreshing to note that the ancients felt as badly about tax as we do today.
Right.
That it's a burden. So it's good to see that things haven't changed in 3,000 years. It's an oppressive burden. Larry, if you can reach out to Alan Brody, because he just mentioned in the WhatsApp group text that he also can't get in. If you've been able to help Barry, can you help Alan as well? Great. Any other things we want to raise on the verse before we? Yes, Marshall, please.
Marshall, you translated the word sivotam as sufferings, and yet Alter translates it as burden. And you think of the word sabal, who is a porter, who carries a burden.
Yeah. We spent a little bit of time this last week. Sabal, Samech Bet Lamed is a great root because in English we separate out the negative and the normative notions of burden. So to tolerate something in English or to endure something is usually a sign of strength. To suffer something is a sign of misery. In Hebrew, both are built into that root. It reminds me, I may have shared this before because I sometimes forget what I've shared. About a month or 6 weeks after the initial, I guess it's still the same war on against terror that the Bush administration announced after 9/11, there was an article in the there used to be a wonderful column in the New York Times Magazine written by William Safire of blessed memory called On Language. Did a tremendous weekly dive into Shorashim, but English Shorashim. It was beautiful to watch him write. And he noted the
what he thinks was an unintended double entendre of the name of that war. Like wars have names, they have names attached to them, right? So they don't know the name of at least the initial name of the war against Afghanistan, launched in October or November 2001. It was called Enduring Freedom. And he noted that what they probably meant by naming it that way was ongoing, long-standing freedom. May freedom endure. But endure also means to suffer, to be willing to endure, to tolerate. And he said that there might be something unintended and lyrical about the fact that by trying to impose our notion of freedom on those who see it differently, we might be asking them to endure freedom, enduring freedom. Some of that is built into Samech Bet Lamed. Lisbol means to carry a burden like a porter does, as Marshall mentioned, and it also means to suffer underneath that burden. And it's built into the same root. But if maybe someone can think of an English version, an English word, Joel, that is similar to that, has the double meaning. Maybe endure. Go ahead.
Well, it's not so modern, but suffer used to mean the same thing. To suffer fools means to tolerate fools.
Right. Right. When you use the word to suffer in that way, it's suggesting that you're tolerating them, although you'd rather not tolerate them. Right? Because actually most people, that phrase is usually referred to people who will not suffer fools, right? Who don't want to tolerate them because they are intolerable. Rick, beautiful. Right. Suffrage. Great. I forgot that word. Okay. Can we go into the Rashi? Everyone okay with that? Okay. Larry, you want to read the Rashi now that you have collected all the Jews Me'arbak and Fota Aretz?
Okay, I'm unmuted.
Okay.
So, we're on verse 11, Alav. Okay. Al Ha'am. So, on the people.
Okay. So, two-word Rashis are either really easy or really hard, right? So the question one would ask on Alav is who's connected to that preposition, upon whom? And the reason why you have to ask the question is because, as we've been dealing with throughout these last two verses, the nation, which is a plurality of people, is being referred to by a singular noun. So Rashi resolves it by saying al ha'am, on the nation, as opposed to I don't know what. Hey, Boker Tov Natan. What could have, we would call it in rabbinic thought a havamina? What had it not been the people? What other singular object could have been connected to that preposition? If it's not al ha'am, then it's on whom? What notion does Rashi have to disabuse us of, such that he says it's al ha'am? On a singular, Rick saying on a singular Israelite, maybe it'd be hard to kind of create the story around that. If you look at footnote 10 in our pagination, it says, Modi'enu shekain pshat hakatuv. Rashi's telling us is that sometimes pshat is pshat. It just means exactly what it looks like it means, meaning who was the recipient of this weight? The people. V'lo kamosh nidrash basota, and not as it is drashed out, I would say quite fancifully in Masechet Sota. And if you'll notice, it's the same page of Sota that we've been dealing with now. So if we were studying Talmud and not Rashi, we'd be focusing on this verse in the Talmud for a little bit. Shakol hakatuv midaber befaro. There's a midrash in Rashi that says that this entire verse is related to Pharaoh, which would be strange. By Asimu alav sarei misim, they would place upon him, Pharaoh, ministers of tax, of burden. Shetalu lefaro mil I think it's milbain or malbain. Maybe Vera can help us. But sabaro. Vera, how would you translate that? What would be the best way to translate it?
I can. Oh, okay. Sorry, which one? Tell me this again. Number 11.
Footnote 10. Do you have our book?
No, I have a different one.
Mem. What's the best way to translate Mem Lamed Bet Nun? Shetalu lefaro malben betsavaro. What did they hang upon Pharaoh's neck?
Maybe something heavy made out of, like to symbol suffering or make it heavy.
Yeah,
it can be also milibo. No, there's a nun there.
Right. It has something to do with the same word that means a brick, like the frame.
The brick is levena.
Right.
So if you take the mem out, then it becomes lamed bet nun, like levena is a brick. But maybe it's a type of brick or something that is heavy and causing suffering.
Right. So
the dictionary says it's a brick mold.
Right. So if you keep reading, Shetalula Pharaoh Amalben or Milven Betsavaro, they put on a mold upon Pharaoh's neck. Kilomar, Dfus Shosin Bo Halvenim, frame or mold from which you make the very bricks that the Israelites were going to be having to make. Why would Egypt do that? Kadei Shalo Yomru Kol Echad MiYisrael. So no one in Israel would say, Easternis Ani, I'm an Easternis. Anyone know what an Easternis is?
Somebody that is very clean, takes particularly clean, neat, no dirt.
Yeah. In kind of
delicate.
What's that, Marshall?
One who's very, very delicate, almost like pampered.
Correct. In halachic language, Easternis is you're an Easternis to claim an exemption from something you'd rather not do. I remember first learning this concept in Hilchot Sukkot, right? That you're supposed to be able to sit in your sukkah, even in unpleasant weather, and at least say Kiddusha there and have your meal, unless you're an Easternis. An Easternis is someone who has a hard time with temperature changes, or who might get, it's like the princess and the pea, who if a droplet of water falls down from a sukkah, that it's going to ruin their experience. They're not going to be able to do with samachta b'chagecha. They won't be able to enjoy it, and therefore they're exempt from having to do it, right? So Easternis is something you claim for yourself to get an exemption from something burdensome, right? And sometimes it's legit, right? A legit Easternis.
A wuss.
What's that?
A wuss.
I don't know who said that, but okay. Oh, Matt. Okay. So that Israelites would not say, "Hey, too much work for me. I'm an Easternis." Omrimlo, they would say to him, "Klum Easternesata. You're not delicate. You're not fancy. You're not a wuss." Yoter mi Pharaoh, who's used to living in this beautiful palace and never has to raise a finger, even he's got that frame around his neck showing he's going out to work. Right? It's kind of a ridiculous midrash that Rashi's telling us, saying it's not that. Don't imagine for yourself that when they placed this burdensome set of obligations upon it, the him is Pharaoh. That's a midrash and sota. I don't buy it. No, they place it on the people. Right? That's a long way of saying the verse means exactly what we think it means. Questions, comments? Larry, Misim.
Unmute. Okay. Misim, Lashon Mas. Sarim shegovin mahem hamas. V'mahu hamas sheyivnu arei miskonot lefaro.
Okay.
So in the language of tax, or to the language of tax, the ministers or overseers, okay, shegovin, I don't know if it comes from lahagiv or it comes from gova.
No.
But I think it means they put on them.
It comes from the root that means to collect. Legabot, to collect. Like a gabai.
Ligvot.
Right.
Comes from the verb ligvot.
Right.
Okay.
When you collect.
So it's interesting that in kind of Jewish ritual practice, we have the word gabai for Michael Harris, as it were, right? The gabai of the minyan. The original notion of the word gabai in Mishnaic language, is the person who would be assigned in the community to go around and be goveh tzedakah, to collect the money. And then that appointed role got extended to tefillah, even though there's not really a collection, although Michael, I guess, does go around with the tzedakah box and is also goveh tzedakah. But it's now a term obviously used to also mean just like a helper around the shul. Okay? So Sarim shegovin mehem hamas.
So the ministers who collected from them the tax, and what was the tax? That they built cities of Miskanot we discussed for Pharaoh, storage cities for Pharaoh.
Right. So what's the shift in Rashi? Why does Rashi have to ask this question, and mahu amas, and what is the tax? The tax is that they built these cities. What's the chiddush, or what's the problem in the verse that he's dealing with such that he has to approach it this way? Matt?
I'm just suggesting that maybe in his day there were actual taxes that they had to pay to the local authorities. And so he's explaining that this is not, we have to give 5 francs every week to the count, but it's something different.
Good. That this notion that a tax can be not only coinage and money, but labor, right? That you can, right. And we know that in ancient economies as opposed to modern economies, that your person and maseh yadecha, the work of your hands, can be a form of payment, right? In fact, in reverse, that you would the notion of an indentured servitude, at least in some societies, is that if you didn't have the funds to pay back your obligation, you could pay back with your work, right? And remember what Leonard shared with us last week, that in early Hebrew, mas may not have been taxed. Leonard, remind everybody what else the word could mean.
Forced labor force.
Right. So
that wasn't me, but yes, that I agree.
I thought it was you in your dictionary. No, that was Marshall last week.
No, it wasn't in my dictionary, but I wasn't the one who answered your question.
Okay, you're a tremendous ventriloquist. You threw your voice all the way to Lindenhurst. Right. So once Rashi makes the decision to translate misim from the word mas, which he knows the readers associate with actually paying taxes, as opposed to what he could have done, which is translate the word to mean forced labor, he says, now we have a problem in the verse. What are tax collectors going to do? What's the relationship between a tax collector and a foreman on a job, right? If the people that were set up against the Israelites were sarei misim, right? IRS accountants. How does that translate into laman anoto b'sivlotam? So then Rashi has to build a second bridge. Because he chose to translate it this way, he's got to build a bridge. Yes, they were tax collectors, and the way this tax was paid was in forced labor.
So can I make a comment?
So the dictionary says that it's a body of forced laborers. So instead of saying you owe me 5 francs, it's like you owe me 5 laborers.
Correct. Larry?
Well, it seems to me to be very similar to a feudal system where the tax would be collected in terms of the part of the crop, or in the sharecropping system. And in the sharecropping system, in fact, you had people who were responsible for enforcing the payment of this tax, which would be equivalent to the rent. And that's what these misim were, and that's what the overseers would be like. Right.
And I think that, again, this hava amina that I think Rashi is trying to make us not think, right? That's a hava amina. What you might have said, but it's wrong. Hava amina, literally, what I would have said. Don't think of these as number crunchers, right? Once I define them as sarei misim, ministers of tax, you might think of them as number crunchers with slide rules. No. They were set up to collect the tax, and the tax would be collected in labor, in blood, in sweat, in productivity, which is already the image that we have. And by the way, that's what gets when someone's telling the story of the Exodus, whether you're Yul Brenner and Cecil B. DeMille, or you're around your Seder table next week, we're going to say that the Egyptians set up what upon the Israelites? Taskmasters. It's coincidental that sounds like tax masters, right? But we don't call them tax collectors, but taskmasters. And Rashi is building the bridge in the verse from misim, which he's reading as tax, to this burden upon them. Barry, please.
In in monetary taxation, some people, it's less burdensome for some and more burdensome for others, depending on how it's structured, progressive-wise, depending on one's yield produce. But here, everyone is equal. Everyone is just a laborer, regardless of what their produce is or their status in society. They are all building these structures.
Great. Thank you, Barry. Norm?
It's not uncommon for governments to levy and allow substitutes to take the place of the person who's going. As recently as 105 years ago in the Russian Empire, and I assume many other places, if you got a draft notice, you could get somebody else to go in your place. And similarly, with Pharaoh, if he says, I need, 3 worker days, he doesn't care if one worker comes for the 3 days or if 2 workers come for, or 3 workers come for 1 day. It's just a function of how much time he's getting from the community.
Interesting. So I thought you were going to make actually the exact opposite point, that if Mas is finances, then however the money comes in, doesn't matter if it's from you or someone else. If this individual tax is your personal human productivity, then you can't offload it to someone else because you will not have produced the Mas. If the Mas is your labor as opposed to the value of your labor, then there's no way to pawn it off. You were making the opposite argument.
It has to be you, but if it's just he needs that much labor from you, if you can afford to get somebody else or somebody else volunteers to go in your stead, he doesn't care.
Got it. Yes, Diane, please.
So in contrast to that, because the verb used is used in the singular form for the people, it suggests that this was imposed on all the people. Not that you could get out of it by having somebody go to their place, but that this is actually imposed on all the people.
That's the impact of that singular, right? On the entirety of the nation, not on a group of individuals. Interesting. Right. So you're using the singular to actually say this is not about single individuals, but about the entirety of the nation. And if one of them is not producing, then that singular alav would not have been played out properly.
Right. And I just wanted to point out that even in English, this word people is both singular and plural.
Grammatically?
Grammatically. Grammatically. You can have a people, or you can have a person and people.
Right.
Like right now, the people are as a plural. Not the people is, the people are confined to their homes.
Right.
But Jews are a people. And that people, has a home in Israel. So that's singular.
Right.
And plural.
Right, it's
both. Rebecca.
Yeah, I was just thinking there's the expression, this is so taxing, this work is so taxing, that it's an expression of, exhaustion or physical, some sort of physical manifestation when you say this is taxing on me.
Yes, right. That the double way in which mas may have been used then for financial tax and physical burden has found its way into English. Correct. Exactly right. Larry, do you want to keep going?
Sure, especially since the next one is really interesting. Okay, so Laman anoto besivlotam, and the only comment, and then Rashi's comment is Shal Mitzrayim. So, in order to oppress them or impoverish them in their burdens, and what Rashi says is of the Egyptians.
Right. So, what's the pshat of Rashi? How does that sentence make sense in Rashi's eyes?
Well, I suppose that the Israelite slaves are taking over the burdens of the Egyptians, in this case, to do the labor.
Okay, so one way of reading it, which is not the way most people read Rashi, but it doesn't matter. That's the way you're reading Rashi. Is that their burdens means the Israelites are being placed on the Israelite shoulders the work that otherwise would have been done by Egyptian laborers, right? That's one way of reading it. What's another way of reading the pshat of Rashi? The simple meaning of what Rashi means. Barry?
I'm just with Larry on this. The previous story just before this is the Egyptians were burdened by Joseph. Joseph had burdened all the Egyptians to produce during the time of famine. Now they're switching the burden.
Switching the burden. So you're agreeing with Larry's reading it. Is there another, I know it's just a 2-word Rashi, is there another way of reading the simple meaning of what Rashi means? Matt?
I think you could say to the burdens that they already had, whatever they were.
Meaning what?
Well, I don't know. They have to work for a living. They have to pay tax.
I'm
not.
Try again. I'm missing it.
Okay. Let me just check it. Well, just to be the burdens of the Egyptians. In other words, I guess that these are the burdens that the Egyptians are putting upon them in addition to whatever burdens they already have.
That's the second way of reading it, right? So Rashi's 2-word, rather simple explanation diverges into 2 possible meanings, which leads us basically to the same place, but it's different grammar. One is what Larry and what Barry were saying, that in order to oppress the Israelites, the nation, with their burdens, with the burdens which otherwise would have been upon the Egyptians to produce for their Pharaoh, because Pharaoh was not necessarily a benevolent king to his own people, right? Or in order to oppress the nation with their burdens, the burdens that they were going to put on them, right? That they're being Egyptians, these are Egyptian burdens, right? Even in English, Egyptian burdens can mean 2 things. Burdens that the Egyptians are experiencing, burdens that the Egyptians are placing, right? And we're painting the same picture, right? The Israelites are working hard because of the Egyptians, but that their word in the verse can be read in more than one ways. And again, it plays on the fact that there's a super commentary in Rashi called the Maharik, Rabbi Yosef Colon. I forgot, I think it's from Italy, but I'm not sure exactly where, who says that this follows the pattern. I'll read to you a tamsit of what the Maharik says from a different book. Hold on one second. This is his commentary on Rashi's commentary. Al Yedei Sivlotam, by means of their burdens, Shel Mitzrayim, the Egyptian burdens. What does that mean? Shehu Hasevel, that is the burdensomeness, the weight, the Havodah, and the work, Hakasha, the hard work, Shehan Mitzrim Mitilim Alehem, that the Egyptians are placing upon them. V'chol Kol Ha'amor Kan B'Lashon Yachid, Musab al Am Yisrael. Every singular concept in these set of verses is referred to Israel. Alav, Anoto. The word we're coming up in the next verse, Vayivein, and they built. Actually, the next phrase. The Ha'amor B'Lashon, and that which is written, B'Lashon Rabim, in plural, Musab is referring to Al Anshe Mitzrayim, the Egyptians. So we kept looking at the singular notion of the people, and it's a pattern throughout these verses that Israel is always referred to, at least according to this read, in the singular. Egyptians are always referred to as in the plural. Larry, and then Marshall.
So I'd like to give a political economy read on Rashi's commentary here,
please,
whether it's intended it or not, because the difference between the Pshat read that you give it and the interpretation that I originally had along with Barry is, imagine that we're distinguishing between Pharaoh being the part of the ruling class, and the Egyptians being the Egyptian people. Pharaoh was never going to work to build these storehouses whatsoever. It would be the Egyptian working class who would have to do that. And instead they found a substitute, which were the Israelite slaves. So it's very similar to the relations, for example, between poor whites in the South during the pre-Civil War period, or even the antebellum period, and then the black slaves who took over not only worked for the plantation owners, but to some extent took over some of the work that the proletariat white would have taken over. And to make an even greater leap that I don't expect anybody to accept, it would be also a distinction between labor and capital. There's labor-saving capital, which unburdens workers, and then there's the sort of capital formation which actually causes laborers to have to work even more and even harder. So that's a bit of a stretch, but there you go.
I'm not sure it's much of a stretch. I think I was on my flight back from APAC. I saw the movie Harriet, about Harriet Tubman, right? Just yet another extraordinary, wrenching movie about the slave experience. It's the kind of movie that makes you feel ashamed of the color of your own skin. There's one scene in there where the movie does an extraordinary job of not making the slave owners actually sympathetic, but making it clear why they thought of one another sympathetically, and how in that internalized internal society, they had their own version of claims to why they needed to do what they were doing. Not so that the viewer has sympathy for them, but you have sympathy for how psychologically warped it was, right? And where they're talking about what will happen if, I forgot exactly what scene it was, where either when Harriet goes or when her siblings go, and they're reacting to the fact that if we don't have these slaves, then we're going to have to do that work. We're going to be our own slaves. We're going to have to do those burdens because we still have to produce. We still have to pay our own expenses. And if it's either their suffering or our suffering, and it's warped, but you almost hear the human being saying, well, if I have to choose between my suffering or their suffering, I'm going to choose their suffering. Right? So what you're saying, Larry, is that the sivlotam is indeed like it's like a suffering transplant, right? Or a suffering transference. Being placed upon the Israelites is the bone-breaking, back-crushing work that were it not on their backs, it would be on lower-class Egyptians. I'm not sure that's what Rashi means, but I think it's a fascinating read of this of the political economy of the story. I think, although I couldn't be convinced by the commentaries on Rashi, that what Rashi means is the suffering that the Egyptians put on them. This is my thought. Hands, Barry, and then Vered.
The sivlotam is plural, and anoto is singular. So we can't be referring to the plural burdens on it. So it's got to be the plural burdens of the Egyptians.
They placed on it, the singular people, their plural burdens.
Plural burdens. Yes, their burden. Whose burdens? Not. It's originating from the Egyptians.
Right. So that's one way of reading that phrase. Vered, Vaksha. Vered, you're muted. Mute yourself. Lo shomim otach. Vered, lo shomim.
Okay, sorry. It just takes me always the time. I want to say that the miskenot is a little bit different idea that I read about it, is because those two cities were already built in the past.
Oh, wait, hold on. Rega, let's see that idea in Rashi, and then I want to hear what you have to say. But I don't want to give the store away just yet. So Rega, 1 second. Okay, Marshall, and then we're going to go back to Larry reading the text.
I just wanted to go back to the beginning words of Rashi, where he says Misim is Lishon Mas. So the question is, why doesn't he even have to say that? In the Gelbar Lifshuto Shel Rashi book, there's an interesting comment. Lo matzinu b'chol hamikra, we did not find throughout the entire biblical text, parat lechad, except here, the word mas b'lashon rabin. We never found the word mas in a plural sense. So therefore, if you look at the Targum of Onkelos, he translates this word as sarei shiltonin mav ishin, which can be translated as evil-doing taskmasters. We know the Hebrew word mem aleph sin, which sounds like mas, is really ma'as, like mius, to be disgusted with, to be fed up with.
Great. It's a wonderful comment, Marshall, for a number of reasons, including the tremendous challenge of how to create the modern Hebrew language from the biblical text. So, even if the singular mas means tax, as Marshall pointed out, this is the only place in the Bible where it's pluralized into misim, which either means that is indeed the plural of the word mas, which is how it is in modern Hebrew, right? The plural, even though you could make the argument that the plural for mas should have been masim, the plural for mas in modern Hebrew is misim, or misim in the biblical text, which we have here, was never supposed to be the plural of the singular mas, right? And that it might rather relate to the root mem aleph samech with the aleph missing. But when they came to modernize Hebrew, they said, we have a word that looks like it is the plural of the single mas, and that's what it is. The plural of mas in Hebrew is misim. Okay, let's go to Larry. Let's keep reading on Arei Miskanot.
Okay, Arei Miskanot, כתרגומו, וכן לך בו אל הסוכן הזה. And there's a reference to Yeshayahu there. And then Gizbar HaMimuna Al HaOtzrot. So first of all, okay, so it says as in the Tirgum. So I assume he's talking about Onkelos there.
Yeah. Yes.
And you're gonna have to read that. Although I think is it Kirvei Beit Otzrei?
Yeah, you know it more than you think you know it. Is there a Hebrew word you can think of, Larry, that is similar to kirva, like kiryah?
Yeah, okay, kiryah, okay. So it's the kiryah is where the military, I don't even know how to translate it. It's where the kiryah is where the high command of the Israeli military is.
Right, and in
the Pentagon.
Kiryah is just a town or a village, right? Like Kiryat Gat, Kiryat Motzkin, right? So the way Onkelos translates the phrase Vayiven Arei Miskanot,
treasury cities,
right? Uveno, they built. Interesting. Onkelos pluralizes this, even though Rashi's at pains to keep it in the singular. Vayiven in Hebrew as and it built. Uveno is like uvanu, and they built. So Onkelos turns it into the plural in his translation. Kirvei, which is the Aramaic plural of the word that means a kiryah, a town. Kirvei Beit Otsara. So say that again, Larry. What would that mean? Cities of what?
Treasury cities.
Treasury cities, right? So Onkelos does not use the Aramaic translation of a root that is similar to Samech Kuf Kaf Nun Miskein Sachan to translate it. He says, no, whatever this word Miskein means, it has to do with treasury cities. So Rashi says, that's what I think the word means. What I think the word means is what they built are places where stores of funds and important produce and medical masks were kept for the federal society. Okay, go ahead into the Rashi.
So then he goes on, V'chein lech bo el hasochen hazeh. So go, come to the. A sochen is a like insurance sochen, an agent.
Right.
Everyone has an insurance sochen to that sochen. And I actually looked up the Isaiah. I really don't know it, but it says, Ko amar Adonai Elohim, Tzevaot lech bo el hasochen hazeh, al shevna asher al habayit. And my translation, or the translation I have here is, thus says the Lord God of hosts, go get thee to this steward, to Shevna, I have no idea what Shevna is, who is over the house. So
steward's a great word. Steward is actually a great English word for that. So it's a rather obscure passage in Isaiah. It doesn't appear in a haftarah, so you would only know it if you were a student of Isaiah. That Isaiah is given this instruction from God to go to a dude named Shevna, who was some kind of a financial steward of the temple. And he also, one of the ways of, one of the commentaries here, Hora'at Adonai Yeshayahu Lemasor Leshevna. It's an instruction of God to Isaiah to go over to Shevna, Hasochein Nibuat Pur Anot Alav, in order to transmit to Shevna the prophecy of doom upon him, right? And who was this Shevna according to Rashi? Gizbar?
Treasurer.
He was a treasurer, right? So let's build the comment. We have a reference in Isaiah of the root Samech Vav, or the root Samech Kaf Nun, Sochein, which we know in modern Hebrew means an agent. And who was this person back then, Sochein? Who was the Sochein? It was a guy named Shevna. He was the treasurer of Hamuneh al Ha'utzerot, who was responsible for all of the storehouses in the temple. So that role, at least in Isaiah's time, was referred to as a Sochein. So if Sochein is the one responsible for the storehouses, then a Miskein can be the storehouses. Rashi is alert to the fact that we would otherwise be tempted to translate the word miskein from other root forms that look similar, but it is not that. It has to do with storehouses, which means that even though Onkelos doesn't use the root to translate the phrase, he just puts it into different language. Rashi says there's actually a Hebrew word that works here, and it does go into modern Hebrew because a sochein in modern Israeli society is someone who is a steward over something having to do with finances. Right? Something having to do with finances. Comments, questions on that? Bye, Jeannie. Who's hand? Andrew.
Yeah, I wanted to point out it seems to me like there's a tragic counterpoint to this Arei Miskanot that occurred not too many parakim ago. What this brings to mind to me is the last time the Torah mentioned the creation of special Arim, multiple cities where something was collected under the oversight of Paro. It was when Yosef was saving Egypt by telling them they needed to create special cities where food was to be, where the grain was to be stored. And now I feel like we're seeing this play out in a much different way, but instead of as a means of, it's about oppressing the descendants of the people who saved them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that is a great association that I not thought of. Right. And particularly when we were in the end of Breshit and we're thinking about all of the jumps forward and the references, the imagery of the end of Yosef's life and how that's going to play out in Shemot, right? We didn't mention that one. I'm glad you're mentioning it now, right? That storehouses to save the people, storehouses to oppress the very people who had been the saviors in the previous narrative. Beautiful. Barry.
Yeah, again, we're bookending the story, the previous story, Joseph and the Israelites on top. Now we have a Pharaoh and the Egyptians on top.
Great.
It's
right.
bookending.
And once again, the undulation shift, right? Joseph in the pit, Joseph up. Israelites down, Israelites up,
because they're responsible for the tremendous treasury in the storehouses, Israelites being forced to produce the storehouses that will hold the treasury that they'll never have any access to. Great. Okay. Where are we? Any other hands that are up now? Okay. You're almost done, Larry. You got one more little piece of this Rashi, and then after you read that, we'll hear Vered's comment from before, because now it's going to become relevant. Okay.
I'm ready for it. Okay. Et Pitom ve'et Ramses shelo hayu reuyot mitchila lechach ve'asa chazakot uvetzorot le'otzar. So he's saying they didn't. I don't know what the rayuta, what rayot is exactly.
Ready, appropriate.
Okay, Rui. Okay. So, they weren't readied from the beginning. They didn't build them from the beginning, I guess. But they made and they strengthened and they shaped them for treasure.
Right. So you got the words exactly right. That were without Rashi explaining. This is how Rashi often works. Why he's saying what he's saying, because he believes that we're going to follow his line of presumptions. What does it mean to say they built Pitom and Ramses? That they, meaning these cities, Pitom and Ramses, had not been ready for this purpose yet. What purpose? To be a storehouse city. And so in this project, Asaum, they made them, meaning the Israelites made them, Chazakot, strong, Ubetzurot, and fortified, La'otzar, to be a garrison, a place where the nation's riches could be stored. What's the assumption that is driving this comment by Rashi? It only makes sense if you have what assumption?
That they were not originally for storehouses, fortifications.
Right, and okay, we're
and that the locations existed beforehand.
They existed beforehand,
but
right?
More than that, Rashi knew that Rashi somehow Rashi knew the archaeology that I can't even imagine existed at the time.
Right.
Okay, he may have known that archaeology. Let's say what he's not saying, or let's say what he's saying we shouldn't think. Don't think that this verse means that in this initial process of the Egyptians oppressing the Israelites, what got built out of the sand? Pitom and Ramses. Like, what's that planned Palestinian city in the Shomron, Rawabi, right? It didn't exist. And under Salam Fayyad's leadership, this notion of trying to bring the Palestinians out from their misery with economic uplift. Let's build a city out of nothing. Nothing existed before. We're not going to start with a village. We're building a city, Rawabi, right? It's still in process. Don't think that that's what this is, that there was an empty part of Egypt where nothing existed. The Israelites were sent there to build something out of the sand. What came out was Pitom and Ramses. It's not that. It's that Pitom and Ramses existed on some level. What they didn't exist for was being a storehouse city, and the Israelites were doing the hard labor to do a what would Ofer call this, Sue? Like a rebuild, right? Not building from scratch, but a renovation. They renovated the cities to make it into be worthy of storehouses. Now, you might think, how did Rashi know the archaeology? He may have known the archaeology. He also may have known the book of Breshit. Open up, if you have a full Chumash, to Breshit 47:11. Speaking of ways in which the end of the book of Breshit presages the beginning of the book of Shemot. Look at 47:11. Who's got it in Hebrew? Who wants to read it out loud? Natan.
ויושב יוסף את אביו ואת אחיו, ויתן להם אחוזה בארץ מצרים, במיטב הארץ.
Pause. So when Joseph's brothers come after the reunion, he settles them, his father and his brothers, in the Meitav haaretz, in the best part of the land of Egypt. And what was the best part of the land of Egypt?
בארץ רמסס כאשר ציווה פרעה.
In the area of Ramses where Pharaoh had commanded. So we did mention it back then. We didn't linger on it. That and Tova is going to share something, I'm sure, in a second. That Ramses as a name, potentially named after for the Pharaoh, already exists in the Torah. And so since Rashi assumes that we're going to remember that, Rashi is going to assume we're going to be befuddled as readers. What does it mean that they built Pithom and Ramses? At least one of those existed. I know that from Parshat Vayigash, right? I already know that. So Rashi says, both Ramses, which is mentioned in Parshat Vayigash, and Pithom existed. They just didn't exist for this purpose, and therefore the way that the Israelites were put to the task was to make these cities into something they hadn't been before now. Tova, please, and then Bered. Hope you're muted. Let me unmute you. Okay, go ahead. Start again.
Okay, from an archaeological point of view, there is evidence of a territorial area in the Delta that was referred to as Ramesses earlier that may have been associated with the family, the dynasty that later becomes the 19th dynasty. But we know that Ramesses II built a new city called Pi-Ramesses in the Delta. That was the capital of Egypt during his reign. And so there's sort of a confusion, if you will, between that city that we know he built and an territory called Ramesses that existed earlier.
Great. And Vered, now what you were going to say before, and then I'm going to add one last comment on this before we end. Go ahead.
Mute me. Okay. So actually, I'm going to say that Ramses, the name, is built on a Hebrew root, which is Reish Samech Samech. And I read that it's in Masechet Sotah, which Rashi brings, and it says, Lama Nikra Shma Ramses. Why was it named Ramses? Because Rishon Mitoses. So the bricks that they built weren't holding, and they were falling apart. And it was a mediocre city, a mediocre build. And now the task is to take this city that is actually falling apart, and you have to make it as a fortress. So the work that you have to invest in it will cause suffering. This is a very, very difficult task, to take something that is not holding, that is falling apart, and now you have to build it as a fortress to such an extent that the Gizbar will come and collect money from a city that has to be a storage place, and it's not holding it, it's just falling apart.
Great. Right. So the rabbis love to play Hebrew verbal games on roots that are almost certainly not from that root. So you could that's a play on Ramses from the Hebrew root rasas, to be that the bricks were not built well. Last comment, and sometimes in a Talmudic argument, a rabbi will put forth what seems to be a far-fetched reading of a text, and then go back into the text and say daikan name, that if you really read closely the original language, you'll see that this interpretation, which is far-fetched, is actually built into the structure of the sentence. So some people say that on Rashi's comment here, that there's a difference between what we have in the Torah, vayivein, they built these storehouses, kama et Pithom and et Ramses, the difference between that and how the Torah could have been written, vayivein et Pithom et Ramses. They built Pithom and Ramses. If the Torah had said they built Pithom and Ramses, there'd be no way of understanding it other than they built them from scratch. But since the Torah wrote I know singular, built these cities of storehouses, almost like a colon or a semicolon. Which ones? Yeah, they made Pithom and Ramses, which you all know what they are, into these storehouses. That because the sentence is structured that way, the notion of reading it such that they already existed, which probably matches the history, makes some sense. It didn't say they built. What did they build? Pithom and Ramses.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.